In a previous video, we talked about the Saturn V, the rocket that NASA used to land humans on the moon for the very first time. However, since Apollo 17 in 1972, humans never landed on the moon. However, NASA wants to change that with the Artemis program, which aims to land humans on the moon again. One of the main elements of the Artemis program is the SLS. We are going to talk about it in today's video. SLS stands for Space Launch System. As of the release date of this video, the SLS only lifted off the pad once, in the Artemis 1 mission. Artemis 1 was an uncrewed test flight of the SLS. It launched on November 16, 2022. The SLS carries a spacecraft known as the Orion spacecraft. The main component of the Orion spacecraft is the capsule or crew module. It is where the astronauts will stay during the mission. The SLS has a launch escape system, which can help the Orion spacecraft get away from the SLS in case of danger. The SLS has two solid rocket boosters. They use solid fuel and they produce most of the thrust of the SLS. The SLS also has 4 RS-25 engines, which last longer than the solid rocket boosters but produce less thrust. The SLS lifts off the pad propelled by 2 solid rocket boosters and 4 RS-25 engines. The engines used by the SLS are very similar to the ones that were used by the Space Shuttle, with the main differences being that the SLS uses larger SRBs, and the SLS uses 4 RS-25 engines, while the shuttle only used 3. The SRBs, or solid rocket boosters, separate from the SLS when they run out of solid fuel. Since the Space Launch System is expendable, the solid rocket boosters do not get reused and crash into the ocean. The abort system is jettisoned since it is not needed anymore, and the core stage separates from the SLS. Then, the Orion spacecraft deploys its solar panels and the second stage of the SLS ignites its engine. This gets the Orion spacecraft into a translunar injection, which is a trajectory where it will reach the moon but it is not in lunar orbit yet. When the Orion spacecraft is on a translunar injection, the second stage of the SLS separates. Then, the Orion spacecraft ignites its engines in order to get to lunar orbit. Here comes the interesting part. The Orion spacecraft actually cannot land on the moon. In the Apollo program, the Saturn V carried a spacecraft dedicated to landing on the moon. But for the Artemis program, the SLS does not carry any spacecraft to land on the moon. Instead, the Orion spacecraft relies on another spacecraft known as Starship HLS. Starship HLS, or Human Landing System, is a modified version of the SpaceX Starship. Starship HLS uses a super heavy booster to get to space, just like any normal Starship. Starship HLS is a giant compared to the Orion spacecraft, with a mass of 1.5 thousand tons. This makes it too massive to directly fly to the moon. Instead, it needs to be refueled in low Earth orbit, in a process known as orbital refueling. After the Starship HLS gets refueled, it will ignite its engines and do a translunar injection burn. It will reach lunar orbit and wait for the Orion spacecraft there. When the Orion spacecraft reaches lunar orbit, it will dock with the Starship HLS. The Orion spacecraft is capable of hosting 4 astronauts. 2 astronauts will leave the Orion spacecraft and get inside of the Starship HLS in order to land on the moon, while 2 other astronauts will stay in lunar orbit inside of the Orion spacecraft. The Starship HLS will separate from the Orion spacecraft and land on the moon. After staying on the moon, the Starship HLS lifts off, gets to lunar orbit, and docks with the Orion spacecraft. Then, the astronauts that landed on the moon move back to the Orion spacecraft. The Starship HLS separates from the Orion spacecraft, and the Orion spacecraft ignites its engines to get back to Earth. Then, the Orion spacecraft re-enters the Earth's atmosphere and performs an ocean splashdown. Now, let's look at some of the specifications of the SLS. The SLS is very large, with a height of 98 meters and a mass of 2.6 thousand tons. The current version of the SLS is able to carry 27 tons of cargo to the moon. However, future versions of the SLS should be able to carry much more. The core stage of the SLS uses liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen to fuel its RS-25 engines, while the solid rocket boosters use solid rocket fuel. And that's the end of our video. Bye, see you next time.